this land, the Gunditjmara people, this beautiful country that we are standing on, our land. Thank you. And to start with saying a huge thank you to Blarney on behalf of Southwest Makers Association. Joe and Dean are incredibly generous in the support they're providing to this organisation, so thank you for that. Today we're really honoured to have Julie, internationally famous seaweed textile artist, guru and delightful person, here in Port Fairy for the week as a residency, supported by funding from the Fletcher Jones Foundation, and that was all facilitated by Joe Grant from Regional Arts Victoria. So we're very fortunate to have Julie here. Just a little bit for those who may not be quite so familiar with Southwest Makers Association. We're a new organisation. We're desperately trying to get council to buy maybe the fire station, if we can lobby hard enough and whack them on the head and tell them how important arts is. But we don't have a home for arts apart from Blarney Books in the town, and it's really important that we as artists have a point of gathering. As I say, the studio is the footy sheds and the gallery is the oval, and arts are such an important part to bring people together and to support each other and make together and enjoy it and have fun and say a whole lot of things about ourselves. And we're just missing so much of that in this town with so many interested people. So we're trying to work quite hard to get a physical building that will be the home of community arts in the town. So if you know a councillor, please talk to them. If you know a person working for council, please talk to them. It's about people power, so thank you. I'd like to introduce, first of all, Julie's been doing some workshops. Last weekend we had cyanotype, which is a photographic process that you paint this stuff on paper, and you put a resist or an object on it. You put it out in the sun and you watch it and you go, is it green, is it grey, is it what? And when it's the right colour, you take it inside and you wash it, and it's this most beautiful blue and white. It's just magic, it's wonderful. And the second day we did block printing, which is simple lino cut printing and printing those on paper and then on t-shirt, so great fun. And this weekend we're doing a 2-day indigo vat dyeing, organic vat dyeing, so quite blue we will be. We're by the sea, aren't we? So Julie is a professional textile artist from Canberra, and gained her international recognition for her work that combines her expertise and interest in both science and art. And I can tell you when you do a workshop with it, it's not just chuck it in like I would do, it's measured and thought about. So it's great to learn to have control. I need it. So after a preliminary career working in science, Julie retrained as a textile designer, graduating from Melbourne Institute of Textiles in 1990 and going on to do a Masters at Canberra School of Arts. Since becoming obsessed with all things seaweed, she can either be found on the beach somewhere collecting specimens or in the herbarium basement poring over 19th century collections. Occasionally she surfaces and teaches. In fact, she teaches a lot, and I've got to know Julie from her teaching with Grampian Arts in Halls Gap. So thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. I would also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, and pay my respects to elders past and present and future. So this week I got a little bit of a cough and a sore throat. It's not COVID, but I may have to have a drink of water, or I've got Strepsils handy, so bear with me. So as Marion said, I started my career in science way back in the 70s, working in Bairnsdale in a veterinary laboratory. And this started off my love for science, but I also had an equal love for art, which I did at school. I moved to London in the early 80s, and I didn't come back until 88 and started 89 in the textile design course at Melbourne Institute of Textiles, which is now RMIT Textiles in Brunswick. But that interest in science led me to develop a new way of working with textiles organically, and that was growing bacteria and molds and putting them onto silk with different fruits and fungi. And this is what I'd started doing that in the 90s, and I kind of became known as that lemon lady. And then when I moved to Canberra, I started doing a master's in conjunction with the botany and zoology labs, growing different bacteria and molds to see what other colours it would make. And then that led on to working with other scientists. I received an ANAT, which is Australian Network for Artists and Technology, quite highly sought after residencies to work with scientists, and my scientist was Christine Cargill at the National Botanic Gardens in Canberra, so that was great. And during my masters, I looked at using scanning electron micrographs of plant matter to inform my work. So this is an image of her research, which I've coloured using Photoshop. It's of spores of a very small plant called a hornwort, which is like a moss, but they reproduce by spores, not by seeds. And then she trusted me enough for me to Frankenstein it into these amazing new species of plants. So there's moth egg cases in there, there's wings, there's little bits of spines of animals and all sorts of things. Oh, I keep going backwards, sorry. This was an exhibition I had at Craft Victoria that is made up of digitally printed umbrellas, all put together to make a giant spore, and in the front hand knotted nets made out of glass fibre. And my practice also extends to projections, architectural projections. So this is the National Library of Australia and Questacon. But my love is working with plants and natural materials in particular. So, and looking at research as well. So my practice is heavily research driven. So here you can see what happens when I go on daily walks. Oh, what's around me? Looking at all the leaves. What could you do with all those leaves? Well, I had this idea of using a tool that I found in Japan for making katazome stencils. It's like a single hole punch, and I thought, what happens when you punch holes in those leaves? So I did. I punched holes in the leaves, and then I got obsessed and I categorized them by shape and color and size. And then I thought, what do you do with that now? And so I thought, then you reconstruct something onto paper. So here's some images of some work I had for an exhibition about Charles Darwin, using all those little tiny leaf things. And this was about his grandfather, his wife, and himself. So the size of those little dots, you can see some pricking on the right-hand side. That's made with a pin down the bottom, if you can see that. And so the size of the dots of leaves are very small. And this is the one about his wife, Emma. and all the colours are natural. That were the 3 images up. And then I thought, could you possibly work with something smaller than that? Yes, pollen. So I gathered pollen and then screen printed it onto paper. So I'm just giving you an overview of my practice and how I do get obsessed by things. But mostly what I'm known for and what I teach is natural dyeing. So site-specific natural dyeing to build up a profile of the plants that grow in certain areas, and then I work into them. So it's kind of mapping in a way, and my current project is about mapping. But today we're here to hear about a mysterious seaweed collector of the 19th century and how that came about. So I applied to the National Museum of Australia to have a look at their holdings. What did they have in the botanical realm, hidden away that you never get to see? So in 2016, it took about 2 years to actually get there and apply for funding, and I was fortunate to get funding from the Australia Council. And I thought, oh, this will be great. You can just go through the museum and have a look in the drawers and see what's there. No, I got a little desk in a room full of other people with a computer, and I sat in front of that for 3 months. One of the objects I really wanted to see was this album. And this album had been bought by the museum at auction in 2013. And it didn't have any provenance, so that meant that they did not know who made it. And the museum's mantra is that everything has to have a story, and if it doesn't have a story, they can't show it. So it's been stuck in the repository for 3 years. And I come along and I fell in love with this book. But I didn't see the book. I only saw the high-res images on my computer, and that's how it was for 3 months. Just poring over this book, and I thought, how cool would that be if I could find out, with my detective hat on, who had actually made this. So the curator had already tried, she had delivered talks overseas. We surmised from what was in the book that it was made by a woman. And if you have a look at these images and the poem and the love heart there, it was a woman's pastime of the 18th and 19th century, especially in the 19th century when Queen Victoria was in reign. She actually made her own seaweed albums, which she then gifted to the Queen of Portugal. But they had their residency on the Isle of Wight, and so quite close to the sea. She used to make her own seaweed pressings, and she advocated for fresh air and for people to go out. And that whole thing about women going out started loosening up their way of dressing and not being as chaperoned and getting fresh air and exercise. So when this album came along, I was just transfixed by the beauty of these pressed seaweeds. And some of them had place names and taxa on them, which is the scientific name for them, the years. And I was looking at all the different specimens and all the dates, but I still couldn't work out who had made it. Then one day I actually got a chance to see the real album, and I took my friend, Dr. Christine Cargill from the Botanic Gardens Herbarium with me, so she could have a look at it as well, because her remit is to look at everything that is cryptogam, which means it reproduces by spores, not by seeds. So that's everything from ferns to fungi, mosses, and those sorts of things, bryophytes, liverworts. So we went along and had a look at it, but even then I wasn't allowed to touch the book. There's, you can see someone with their blue gloves on, and she would say, now, which page do you want to look at? And that was it. So because I'd already had a really good relationship with Christine Cargill, I knew a lot of other herbarium curators, and every time I went somewhere I thought, I wonder if they've got any seaweed albums. So I was on a trip to Melbourne for something else, and I went to the National Herbarium in Melbourne, and I said to the curator there, Pina, do you have any seaweed albums? Yeah, we've got a few. Would you like to have a look at some? So she bought some out for me of the era that I was looking at, and I thought, great, I'll open one. And this was the first one I started looking at, and it was attributed to a collector called Richard Bastow, and here's his information that was photocopied in the front of the book. And then I opened it, and yes, that's what I did. Wait, that can't be a coincidence. My God, it's the same poem, same kind of set out. I opened it, and my blood went a bit cold, and I went a bit shaky, and I went, oh my God, Pina. And she went, what? And I said, this isn't Bastow. And she said, who is it? And I said, I don't know, but I'm going to find out. It's the same one that's in the National Museum. So then I had a look at the next one, and I opened that, and there was this funny little pattern in the back of it. So we opened that up, and I said, oh my God, what is that? And Pina, whose father had been a tailor, said, that is a woman's sleeve pattern. And it was. So it was a pattern cut out from a periodical of the day, because they didn't have dressmaking patterns. They just had to make their own. And in that book, there was this photocopy that said there was another similar album by this Tisdall this time, in the University of Melbourne Herbarium. So I quickly made an appointment to go and see that. This was probably several months later. Made an appointment to see their album, which is this one here, and it's attributed to somebody else. But when I opened it, it was the same. And I started getting really, really excited, but also feeling very limited. I just don't know how I'm ever going to find who this is. The handwriting was the same, everything was the same, the locations were the same. And the location started in Ireland in 1851 and went all the way through to Port Phillip Bay and up around Manly. So we knew somebody had come from Ireland in 1854, because there were collections at the Cape of Good Hope in 1854, and then in Melbourne around Port Phillip Bay from then onwards all the way up to Federation. So I thought, how can I crack this nut? So I never been to Ireland, I got a map of Ireland, and I started to database every collection in every one of those albums that I could find. So sometimes there were maybe 400 in each album, 400 specimens, and I systematically went through every one and started plotting along. And I could tell that this person had collected all along the Antrim coast in the north of Ireland. And so then I thought, okay, Irish collection. What if I put Victorian Irish seaweed collector into my search engine? And up came a paper from the phycologist from the Ulster Museum, who had written a paper about a 19th century seaweed album that they had inherited, made by William Sawes and a gentleman called Morrison. So I had two names. I plugged in Sawers, William Sawers, and nothing came up. I put in Morrison, and up came another paper about their seaweed collections, but more importantly, up came a book written by Robin Stacey, Herbarium. And I had this book sitting on my bookshelf, and I hadn't looked at it for ages. And when I looked in that book, there was the same collections by this person. So then it was like that, aha, oh my God, it's Charles Morrison. So she had done this book from a residency at the Sydney Botanic Gardens Herbarium, and so I quickly made an appointment to go up there and have a look at their albums, and these were the 3 albums they had there. And so we know that these are definitely by Charles Morrison, because in the front of each of those books were dedications to his granddaughters and one of his great nieces, Georgina Thomasina Maxwell. These are the front pages of those books. And then these are the collections, so standardised. He has spent a lot of time going through his enormous collection that he brought with him from Ireland and then made since he was in Melbourne, and then put them into Federation gift albums for his granddaughters. But there are also other albums in their collection which were in a different place and weren't attributed to him. So I had a look at them, and they're very different albums. I've sorted these albums into 2 categories, and these are my own choosing. One I call gift albums, and then these I called scientific albums, because these ones were very scientific. They had taxa. These were the albums that he had made in Ireland. These are only Irish collections that he made with his friend William Sawers. And what they were doing was actually collecting to a list of specimens put out by Harvey, who was the eminent Irish phycologist of the time, who actually came out to Australia at the same time, 1854, and he has catalogued all of the Australian seaweeds as well in a 4-volume book called Phycologia Australica, and did all his own illustrations. So for a time I thought it was Harvey, and then no, it wasn't. So this is what the scientific albums are like. And in those albums was a little bit of information about the person who had donated them to the herbarium. So we finally found a picture of Charles Morrison and a little bit of information. So what we found out was Charles Morrison was actually born in Glasgow. He went to Northern Ireland, married an Irish woman from County Tyrone. They had a few children, and then they came out to Australia in 1854 and had a couple more children, and that's about all I could find. I couldn't find what ship they'd come on or anything. Then another chance encounter. This is all full of chance, and another scientist at the Botanic Garden said, "Oh, I think there's one of those albums in Ballarat." And periodically I teach in Ballarat at a forum, and so it's like, right, I have to make time to see that album. So this was their album, which is the same format, different colour velvet cover, and they had attributed it to Landsborough, who was an English collector. And as soon as I saw it, I said, no, this is also by Charles Morrison. So they were able to adjust their provenance. But the museum could never show the album because it had no provenance. So they were really excited, and there'd been a writer, a science writer, who'd said, whenever you want to show that album, I want to write about it. And so it was just really good timing. And what happened was they did a big article in all the Fairfax papers, the Melbourne Age, Canberra Times, all over Australia, with my photo and saying that we would really like it if there were any descendants of Charles Morrison. And we got 2 great replies, one by a doctor and his family in Geelong and his siblings in Melbourne, and another old gentleman in Canberra. Would you believe it? My hometown. And so the elderly gentleman had another album that we'd never seen. So the curator and I went around to his place, and then the relatives from Melbourne all came up to visit him. And eventually John, the elder man, donated his album to the National Museum. But this is his album. And so once we had the family on board, a husband of one of the direct descendants from Charles Morrison had done, I kid you not, the family history of the whole family and all the arms of the family and where everyone went and how they got to Australia. And it was just fabulous because we got to learn all this knowledge about Charles Morrison. And then the family in turn had no idea that he'd made seaweed albums. I mean, the elderly man had, because he had an album, but the other side of the family didn't have any albums, and that it was news to them, so they were super excited. So we could fill in some of the gaps. Charles Morrison was a painter and decorator before he came out to Australia, and then his son, who was also Charles Morrison, ended up becoming a painter and decorator in Sydney, in Oxford Street, and he also made wallpapers and things and ended up refurbishing St Vincent's Hospital in Sydney with the wallpapers and everything. So it's been just this magnificent journey of discovery. But there were questions still around, you know, things still left to be discovered. And I kept going back to this paper and the gaps in it. And obviously from this paper, the Ulster Museum had an album and I had to see it. But it was difficult because they didn't have a curator, funding had been cut, nothing was digitised, and I had to rack my brains and think, how the hell can I get to Ireland? So I thought, I know, us artists are so resourceful. I'll go on an arts residency and I'll do all my research on the side. So that's what I did. I got a residency in the south of Ireland, but on the way there, I went to Trinity College in Dublin and was just allowed into their herbarium all by myself to look at all their old albums. It was just so, they were so trustful. Obviously, I had a bit of cred. I wasn't just some random off the street, but they trusted me with looking through all their old albums. And there's a couple I want to follow up because they have some albums of Australian seaweeds in there that no one's written about yet. And then I went to the Glasnevin Botanic Gardens, also in Dublin, and they did have some Charles Morrison albums, particularly this one, Seaweeds of Inishowen, I think it is. And as soon as I saw it, I knew it was exactly the same as the others. But my residency took me to Ballinskelligs, and I got to stay in these little old crofters' huts. And so your bedroom is right up the top, and it's a split level staircase. I don't know if you've ever walked on one, but one foot goes on one side and one on the other, and the toilet's downstairs, so in the middle of the night you're thinking, do not fall down the stairs. It was fabulous. And of course I did lots of seaweed collecting and also a little bit of pottery with seaweed. So eventually I got up to the Ulster Museum, which was, you know, what I was making a beeline for, to see the album that had been written about in 1978. The woman who gifted the album had since died, Nora Macmillan, and the curator who wrote the paper, I had been in contact with him via email, but he had a bit of dementia, so I didn't end up meeting up with him. But I did go to the herbarium and check out the book, and because they didn't have a phycologist, nobody really knew anything about it, and they weren't sure whose writing was whose. So I've still yet to tell them which is William Saw's writing, which is Charles Morrison's handwriting, and whose specimens are whose for that. It just takes time. So with my original map, I thought, I'm here now. I'm going to follow in the footsteps of Charles Morrison, and my lovely husband, who flew over at the end of my residency, hired a car, and we drove the Antrim coast, and I made sure I collected at every site that Charles Morrison had collected at, and made my own collections where he collected. And I'm still doing all the Australian ones, but I thought I'd better do the Irish ones first. So Giant's Causeway, and these are some of my pressings. So the whole reason for me was, yes, I love this research, but what is the outcome going to be? And it was always going to be an exhibition of artwork. And so in 2019, I had an exhibition at Craft ACT in Canberra called The Hidden Sex. And The Hidden Sex was a play on words relating to two things. One was the way that women were hidden in the 19th century. Their skills were hidden. They weren't allowed to go to university. They weren't allowed to, even if they wrote papers or had anything of any scientific interest, they weren't allowed to present them at the societies. They had to get a male to do that for them. They were supposed to stay at home and learn the skills of sewing and needlework and music and languages and nature collecting. And so I wanted to pay tribute to all those women who actually went out and collected for male counterparts. And the same thing happened in Australia. Ferdinand von Mueller had about 240 women on his books collecting botanical specimens. And I wanted to pay tribute to them because they were the hidden sex. But the hidden sex is also a play on the Latin name for cryptogams. Cryptogan means hidden marriage in Latin, and cryptogam are those plants that reproduce by spores and not by seeds. And the reason why they were called cryptogams is because for a long time, until the invention of high-powered microscopes, scientists didn't know how they reproduced. They just didn't know until they could see spores eventually. And so my exhibition was, I'll say mixed media, but it was an array of things that I made in a variety of media to do with either the hidden sex or the collection, women botanical collectors of the 19th century. So here's a work that is on watercolour paper. It's about this high. and it is a watercolour painting which I have then adhered real seaweeds to mimic embroidery and the embroidery hoop that women would have been embroidering. I found this old amazing civvy-like thing in a junk shop, and I didn't know what I was going to do with it ever, but I am a bit of a collector myself. So I nabbed it, and then I thought, that's perfect. This is what I think women should go out into the sea and gather up their seaweeds with, because imagine being a woman in the 19th century going out onto the beach. We just go out in our thongs or cut-offs or bikinis or whatever. They would have had their full dresses on, boots, gloves, parasols, corsets, everything. And I think, oh my God, how did you do that? I mean, physically, when you're going, if you've ever tried to collect seaweeds, like you can collect them just off the littoral zone, but if you want to grab that one that's just on its way out on the tide, you've got to reach in and get it. And so often a wave will come and bowl you over, and that's happened to me heaps of times. So this is this old sieve which I've called sampler, and I've embroidered it with the alphabet around the outside and then seaweed on the inside. So women's education was often through embroidery. The alphabet when they were young, making samplers with, sayings, religious sayings or what have you, and then maps and geography. And this again is another watercolour painting in that series of a lady's handkerchief, because of course they all had handkerchiefs. And the handkerchief is very interesting because the handkerchief was a device that you could use with which to converse with the opposite sex without your chaperone knowing. So a dropped handkerchief or whatever in the right place, and he'd have to rush up and present it back to you, that sort of thing. It has hidden meanings. And so it's a watercolour painting but with real seaweed as the lace. And the pricking around the outside of these pieces is an Irish lace pattern from the 19th century. And then my other homage was to a 19th century, the first female photographer, Anna Atkins. Anna Atkins was a scientist in her own right, but of course she wasn't allowed to be a scientist. Her father was a scientist, and she and her next door neighbour was Sir John Herschel, who invented the cyanotype process as an early form of photography. So I reignited my love for cyanotype. Anna ended up cataloguing every species of British seaweed. I think there's about 438. She did every single one by cyanotype, then bound them into books and distributed them out to eminent scientists of the time. There's only 11 of these books known in existence at the moment, and the New York Metropolitan Library owns 2 complete sets of them. So you could look her up, or even if you look up New York Met, there's a fabulous book which was too big for me to bring, essays of exactly her work, that of these books that are in the New York Met, called Sun Prints. So I decided I would do not 400 seaweeds, but a selection of seaweeds onto antique lace handkerchiefs that I found on my travels in Ireland and the UK and Australia. And it's called Submerged, and I've left them hanging on the walls so that they kind of go in the breeze as people walk past. And submerged, again, is a double entendre. It's like you're going into the waves, you might get submerged by them. The seaweeds are submerged in the water, but also the submergence of the academic aspirations of women of that time. And then I actually found some vintage kid leather gloves, and I was thinking about those women wearing those gloves. And gloves weren't worn just for decoration. Women had different types of gloves in order to meld their hands into the prescribed shape that a Victorian lady should have their fingers. Not too limp and wristed, but nice tapering fingers. And so these kid gloves were almost like Chinese shoes to those women of that era, to have these beautifully tapered fingers. And so I embroidered the 3 classes of seaweeds onto the leather gloves. So with seaweeds, there's 3 main classes of seaweed: red, green and brown. And it was very hard to find a model to actually fit into those gloves. Not even some children could fit into them. But one day I was at my gym, and there's an elderly Malaysian woman, and I was just noticing her hands, and I said, "Ibu, would you mind being a hand model for my gloves?" And she's the only person I've ever found to actually fit into the gloves. And then this is one of the other pieces that was on the back wall. It was about, it's made with cuttlefish that I've picked up on the beach, and it's a long story why cuttlefish is in amongst seaweed, but I guess if you, I'm keeping my eye on the time, if you wanted to ask me to elaborate further, I can, but it has got to do with hidden sex and the male species pretending to be females in order to attract mates. So one of the other things I was interested in my research was Victorian glass slides, glass microscope slides of the 19th century, and here's a couple of them. And different companies made up the slides for the scientists. Scientists didn't make up their own. And what they do is kind of like a form of advertising, is they put their papers around the slide, and then you just have the little bit with the specimen on. So I decided to make my own giant glass slides. In 2015, I'd done a residency at the Canberra Glassworks, and one of my interests was digital printing, engraving, and trying to work out how I could put seaweeds into that glass. So this provided me with a perfect opportunity. So these slides are 75 centimetres high by 26 centimetres wide. And what I'm paying homage to is 6 different women collectors, Australian women seaweed collectors of the 19th century, and I've digitally printed the paper on them, but they're underneath the cover slip is real pressed seaweeds that I've sandwiched in between the glass, and then done the engraving on the top and the bottom. So what came out of it for the scientists? Well, the University of Melbourne Herbarium, they had that one album, but they were just so amazed that when I started going through some of the old collection books, all I'd need to see is a location and a date, and I'd say, do you mind getting that one out? Now, I don't know if you've been in a herbarium, but everything is in stacks, in folders, and so someone has to get out the ladder go up, find the right thing, come back down and let me have a look at it. So what happened after a couple of times, they went, right, we need someone on this full time. So they managed to get funding, which is very hard in the scientific world, to employ someone to go through everything that I had ticked, and they eventually found 240 loose leaf specimens in their scientific collections that actually belonged to Charles Morrison, not Tisdale, not Bastow, and nobody else. So they were really, really happy with that. And I think knowing that gives them a snapshot of what was around in the 19th century that they can go back and look at now, and compare. So there's one last story, and that is, in my feed, I'm a mad collector, and I love looking at things, anything to do with seaweed. Up popped this auction in Melbourne. It was during COVID, and it said, here's an album made by Tisdale, and the collection dates are blah blah, and I just went, oh my God, it is not going to be Tisdale. And then the price on it was estimated $700. I thought, yes, I can afford that, like crazy. Yes, I can afford that. I'm going to have my own Charles Morrison. And like for about 5 minutes, I was floating on a cloud thinking that's what was going to happen. And then I thought, you idiot, of course it belongs with the family. So I contacted the family in Melbourne, and they had a conversation amongst the three of them. Are we interested in this album? Yes, we are, and we are going to get that album. So everything's kind of happenstance with me. I was coming down to Melbourne to go to Lorne for a friend's 50th, and the album was coming up for auction the day after that weekend. So I hired a car, I got in it, I went to the auction room, I viewed the album. It was in terrible condition. I knew it was a Charles Morrison, and the amazing thing that we didn't know was this inscription in the front, because on the website they only show you some things. So this says, to Myra Myrtle McGee from Grandpa Morrison. And Myra Myrtle McGee was this woman's actual grandmother. So when we saw that, we just both went, oh my God, this album is coming home, not just, so she was emotionally invested. So we went to the auction house. I had to sit up the back. I wasn't going to bid for it. Her husband started bidding for it, and they did get it. And because we were bidding against another dealer who had sold the original album to the National Museum, the price just skyrocketed before we even walked in the door. So all I can say, it was under $5,000. So in total, I found about 15 albums. There's 9 gift albums there, and then there's 6 of the scientific albums, both in Australia and in Ireland. And the last thing is, in the very first album, when I was looking at it, this was on some page, and I don't know if you can read it, but it says Port Fairy, 1959, and ugly red tape sticking down the specimens. And of course, in my research, I just kept saying, I'm not looking at that, I'm not even taking a photo of that, but I did. Thankfully, I found it amongst all my things just yesterday. Because who was this person? Because that album had no dedication to it. So we don't know which granddaughter that first album would have belonged to, but somehow they came to Port Fairy in 1960, or the owner of that album, we don't even know the trajectory of it, because the dealer who sold it to the museum won't give away where he got it from. I might have to try other means to get that information out of him, but I thought, hey, I'm in Port Fairy, I'm just going to show this, and you never know, it might spark an interest. And you can tell me if you've got secret albums stashed away in your collections. So that's my talk. I hope you've enjoyed it. And I do thank all the following institutions for letting me use their images and for letting me into their collections. There is a little video about my research that was made. If you just Google Julie Ryder seaweed, it will come up on YouTube. But I will write something one day. It's just getting around to it, as you know, and trying to fit your own life and new things in, or make it into a podcast or something. But yeah, I'm passionate about doing something a little bit more formally, because it's a way of me giving back to the family who have just been so amazed at all the research that's come out of it, and all the things that their great-great-great-grandfather have done. So yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions. And I do have a little album I've started making of, I actually have not 1,000, but maybe quite a few hundreds pressed seaweeds now, because of course to get into Charles Morrison's head I had to become a seaweed collector. And I just put this together for you today. Nobody else has ever seen this. I've just put them in loosely. I'll do it properly at some point. But it's very easy to go out and find seaweed and press it. The hard bit, if you're not a trained marine biologist or a phycologist, is to actually find the taxa for them. And sometimes you can get to the genus, but the species requires DNA confirmation. So, yeah, that's another lifetime for me, I think. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Julie. Fascinating, fascinating. What little rabbit burrows you can go down and where you end up. So thank you. Do we have any questions?
I'd like to go back to your cuttlefish.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Are you happy for me to do that?
Yes.
Okay, so I am a mad beachcomber collector.
Can you put it on the screen or not?
Oh, yes, sure. Oh, wrong way. Oh. I don't know how to get rid of the side bits, but so in the process of looking for seaweeds, I often came across cuttlefish, and amazing, from this big to this big. And I thought, what on earth, how big would that cuttlefish be to have that just lying on the beach? So one day I was working away and I listened to Richard Feidler conversations or a couple of other people. And as I was working away, there was an interview with a woman who was a marine biologist, and she had this experience with these giant squid. And apparently every winter these giant squid migrate near Whyalla in South Australia, and they all congregate together to mate. And they're giant, and I've seen a giant, one of the giant ones, a dead one, but And when they mate, they all start changing colours, and I don't know if you've seen that. But the story that fascinated me was that it's the bigger cuttlefish will get first choice of all the females, as it is in a lot of things. It's the survival of the strongest and the fittest, and the males fight it out. But what the sneaky part of this story is that the punier cuttlefish don't want to go and fight it out because they're going to lose. So what they do is they change form and pretend to be female, even to the point of having a fake egg sac. So they go past the big tough guys, and that the big male cuttlefish go, oh, it's just a pregnant female. We're not interested in her. So they sidle up to the female cuttlefish, and actually in the reproduction of cuttlefish, they don't actually copulate. They pass a sperm packet from the male to the female. So this puny little cuttlefish gets to sidle up, and then he sneakily passes the sperm packet to the female and then wanders off again. So I had all these cuttlefish and I just loved them, but I didn't know how it was going to fit into my concept for the exhibition, and I didn't know if the curator was going to buy it because it's not seaweed. And then when I heard this story, I thought, yes, that is it. It's the hidden sex, but in the other way. And so I just drilled little holes with my Dremel into all the cuttlefish and placed them on the wall. And that's the story behind the cuttlefish.
Wonderful. Any other questions?
On one of those slides you showed, there seemed to be like a colour wheel or colour card on. What was that for?
Yeah, that's at the herbarium. And so when they're photographing for photographing their specimens, they always put a colour card so that they can
colour match.
Yes,
Right.
yeah, and that happens routinely with any objects in the museums when they're photographing it, so they get true colour. Good question.
Very observant. Okay, we might call it quits. So thank you very much. Just fascinating. I love the science and the methodicalness of it. It does my brain in. So thank you. It's been a great pleasure having Julie here for the week, and we've got a great workshop, and there's one place left if anyone's interested in getting very blue on the weekend. And yeah, here. So thank you.
And if anybody wants to see my little album, I'm happy to put it somewhere and we can just go through it a bit. But also, I said to Joe, do you have any seaweed books? Joe's actually got a great little guide. You've probably seen it, but if not, a guide to the seaweeds and sea life around here. And if you're going to get hooked on seaweed, you'll need something to help you identify it.
So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Joe and Dean, as always.